If the Italian economy is famous for anything, it's probably for how awful it has been doing. From having a long-term stagnation and almost non-existent growth, to young people leaving the country due to a lack of hope for the future, Italy is known as the example that you don't want to follow. But to my own surprise, recently it started to look like things are finally changing for the better. Italy is now showing one of the fastest rates of economic growth in the EU, growing faster than Germany or the UK. And some have even suggested that Italy is now becoming Europe's new economic powerhouse, thanks to the economic policies of its Prime Minister, Giorgia Meloni. But as much as I would want for that to be true, for Italy's sake, the reality is quite different. Italy is finally growing, but not at all for the right reasons. Its growth is very much artificial, and once it ends, things are probably gonna get even worse than they ever were in the beginning. So this is the big problem with Italy's unexpected economic boom. But let's start with the good news. Since 2019, the Italian economy has grown by 3.8%, which doesn't sound as much, but it's actually really good for European standards. With this rate of growth, it has grown twice as much as the French economy and 5 times more than the German one. And it has recovered better from COVID than most of Western Europe. And the Italian stock market is also doing pretty well, and it's showing some unprecedented levels of growth. The index, made up of 40 big Italian companies, rose by around 28% last year, which is more than any other European stock market index. And Italy is on track for even more growth. This year, it's predicted to grow faster than it did in 2023, and next year, in 2025, it's forecasted to increase the pace even further. Now, obviously, the government and its fans are hyping all of this up, and portraying these positive signs as the beginning of Italy's economic turnaround. But as much as I would wish for this to be true, and for the Italian economy to get better, this is mostly the case of spinning the reality of what is actually going on. So here's what's actually happening. Now, the natural tendency of most people is to assume that when we see GDP growth, it means that the economy is doing well, that it's growing because it's healthy, that there are more businesses popping up, they're serving more customers, selling more products, and expanding to more countries. But that is not really the case here, and it hasn't really been the reason why Italy is seeing an economic growth. The reality is that in order to get the economic going during the pandemic, in 2020, the Italian government launched new subsidy schemes. In other words, giving out money. Most of these schemes were in the form of government-funded home renovation measures. Basically, if you decided to renovate your home, the government would pay you at least 50% of your costs, but often much more than that. Under the most popular program, called Super Bonus 110, anyone who renovated their home to make it more energy efficient got all of their expenses completely paid for by the government, plus a 10% refund on top of that through a tax reduction scheme. Now granted, Italy wasn't the only country that was giving out cash to people during the pandemic lockdown in order to stimulate economic activity. But unlike other countries, Italy did not end these programs once the economy opened up, and it continued this unheard of level of support even when things went back to normal. Naturally, Italians took the chance to repair their homes completely on the government's dime and started renovating like crazy, which, according to the chief economist at Commerzbank, is what explains 2/3 of Italy's economic growth since then. Now, the problem with these kinds of programs is that they increase growth, but they also increase inflation, as in this case, more people spend the government money, and since it's not theirs, they don't really care how much anything costs. And the growth that happens is more or less virtual. The only ones who are really benefiting from it are the people who renovate their homes and the companies doing the renovations. These investments don't really create any foundation for future economic growth, and as soon as the money dries out, the growth will stop immediately. And even if the government ends up collecting a little more in taxes from the higher spending, it will be basically just collecting drops of the money that it sent into the economy in the first place. And the only result is a theoretical growth and very real inflation. And the thing is that this way of growing the economy does more damage than benefit, for several reasons. First, it's unsustainable. Italy's new government has recently said that those incentives for home renovations have had a devastating impact on public finances, and it admitted that it will not be able to maintain them in place for very long. Already, Giorgia Meloni's government decreased the funding from paying back 110% of cost to 70%. And the only reason why she didn't kill it entirely is because there are so many projects currently already ongoing, and the voters wouldn't forgive someone who did not give them the money they were promised, and that they mostly already spent. But while it may continue this and the next year, it cannot go on further. And once it's over, Italy will be left without the source of its newly found growth, and with a massive hole in its public finances caused by the renovation scheme instead. The second problem with this is that Italy, unsurprisingly, didn't have enough money in its budget to pay for all of this, and so in order to pay for everything, it had to borrow. A lot. Meaning that all this growth is based primarily on new debt. And Italy has already had a lot of debt even before this started. Italy has the second highest debt in Europe and fifth highest in the world. And this mountain of debt is growing. The EU Commission estimated that Italy's debt will exceed 140% of GDP this year and continue to rise next one. For comparison, in Germany the debt ratio is 66%. And in France, it's close to 100. But by 2028, Italy is forecasted to overtake Greece in debt to GDP and have the highest debt in Europe at 143%. And the problem with this is that the more debt you have, the more you have to pay in interest. And so more and more of your annual budget gets eaten up by the costs of servicing your debt. And Italy, which only narrowly escaped a bankruptcy alongside Greece just 15 years ago, is heading towards this future. And that's not where you want to end up, because, and that's the third reason, these temporary good news only briefly covered up the fact that Italy's structural problems did not go anywhere, and that there are no newly found strengths that it could benefit from. Italy is still struggling with enormous tax evasion, which means that it doesn't collect enough money to pay for everything. And so every year, the state ends up spending more money than it makes. Despite the economic recovery, the country has seen record levels of poverty, and it's still facing a massive brain drain, as 4 out of 5 young Italians want to leave the country, and join hundreds of thousands of those who have already done that in just the past decade. And that's because, well, Italy is still a terrible place for young people to live and work in. They face high unemployment, low wages, and career insecurity, and 1 in 4 of young people is at risk of poverty, and 2/3 of them are living with their parents, not out of choice, but as a result of the situation. And so, all these articles about Italy's economy fueling the European growth, unfortunately, they completely miss the point. In order for Italy to have a real economic recovery, it would have to start making real changes, not just subsidize people's home renovations. But it doesn't look like that should happen anytime soon.